Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Conversations with History. In this episode, we will take a tour of the World War II era. This will be more of a global episode. In the last couple episodes in the 1920s and the Great Depression, the New Deal, we focused a lot on the United States itself, and the 1920s and the era of the Depression were a time of isolation and kind of inward looking for the United States. And while we were looking inward, things were happening around the world that were going to lead to a great conflict. I am joined today by an astute colleague, friend, student, and teacher of history.
You flatter me.
Benson Redmond. How many years have you taught U.S. history?
This is my 8th or 9th year, I think, coming into that.
8 or 9 years. I've had
COVID kind of throws off the timeline. And because of that, I can't remember exactly, but I think this is 8 or 9 years now.
Okay.
So
I've had guests on now with about 5 or 6 years of experience, 24 years of experience in Jeff Robinson, and 18 years of experience with Keith Hawley. So almost a decade of experience here teaching and learning about U.S. history. Today, we're going to cover World War II in a global sense, in the sense of the United States. This is such a huge topic. There's no way we can do this topic real justice in an hour and 30 minutes. There will be things that will be very surface level. Certain things will go a little bit deeper, but there are definitely going to be things that are going to be left out. So if you're listening and you're like, well, they're skipping over this, or I know this happened, and I think we probably are. It's not that I don't, for instance, it's not that I don't know that there were, major battles in North Africa in World War II. It's just we simply do not have the time to go into those things. I mean, we might mention them.
And Ken Burns did 8 or 9 episodes at almost 2 hours a pop.
Yeah,
and still didn't get it all
of World War II.
Of World War II,
right?
And so there's no way that in an hour and a half we can do it. And like you said, it's a global view, and I think that's an important aspect to remember. It really is hard to see this in anything but that global view, and I think that's an important aspect of this. Even though this is U.S. history, that global view, I mean, the whole thing is there.
All right, so we're going to kick this off with the rise of fascism in Europe. So after World War I, Europe is in turmoil, and there begins to be a rift between more traditional and at the time considered conservative or reactionary forces on one side, and more radical left-leaning socialist communist forces on the other. And so in countries like Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in, of course, the Soviet Union, which was previously the Russian Empire before the Bolshevik Revolution, we see these two forces just continue to move not closer together, but farther apart. And so a lot of historians will ask, what brings about this rise of fascism? And a lot of it, they agree, has to do with the economic depression.
I mean, when you really look at it, though, well, one, let's focus on this. As you're emerging out of this conversation that you've had, New Deal, you've talked about, the depression that prompted that economic recovery. It's a global. When we fail to really look at that, it is a global depression, and we don't look at that enough. And I think that really to drive this point home, there's got to be a solution somewhere. There's got to be a solution and an answer to the economic woes, and not just in the United States as we turn to FDR and his New Deal, but then globally. That leads us to this. And one other point that I would throw in there too is after World War I, the collapse of those great empires sent us scurrying into those, I think, that left and right of Europe. And I think that's part of that this conversation. In the rise of these leaders, there's a vacuum of leadership with the collapse of those empires, with the collapse of those economies, and that leads us to this point.
Right. And the first one, really, the first fascist leader is Benito Mussolini.
Yeah.
And in Italy. And he really kind of defines what fascism is going to mean. Right.
And very vague.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he has his doctrine of fascism,
mm-hmm.
but it's still very vague.
And very different from the later German fascism that we will see that's much more based upon race. So basically, I mean, a basic working definition of fascism, what separates fascism from what we might call like Leninist, Stalinist communism is it's basically a word game that in fascism, everything is devoted to the betterment of the state.
It's nationalism on steroids.
Right.
And that, it's a word that we want to throw around in our modern lingo, but we've got to be careful because their fascism of what we saw in the 20s, the 30s, World War II, and the 40s, they are two totally different things.
Right. And so Mussolini comes in with this idea that, and it's partially born out of the idea that Italy gets a raw deal after World War I. They feel like they aren't given any real considerations as far as expansion of their country. Because traditionally, there's been tons of conflict over northern Italy. Does it belong to France? Does it belong to the Austro-Hungarians? Does it belong to this new Italian state? And they felt like they got a raw deal. And Benito Mussolini kind of comes in and he fills this void that Italian people have for their national pride. Because they gave up so much in World War I. They have huge casualties. They're fighting on their northern border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they take huge losses, and they feel like they get nothing in return. Yeah. And so he comes in 1921, he forms the Fascist Party in Italy, and he's elected to their kind of like the Congress of Italy called the Chamber of Deputies in 1921. And then in 1922, he does something that will later be repeated by other fascist leaders. He basically gets his party members, they're called the Black Shirts, about 30,000 of them, they march on Rome, and he is made the prime minister of Italy. Was he really the prime minister?
I mean, when you really look at that, he what I think is so interesting is he does it without firing a shot. Mm-hmm. He gains complete control in that sense as quote unquote prime minister without ever firing a shot. He gains so much power almost instantaneously, and we'll see Hitler do a very similar thing.
So he's really not. He's not. His title is prime minister, but really,
it's a title.
We would say he was a.
I mean, yeah. When we really look at this, he's going to start to foment that power pretty quickly. He's going to do. Hitler's going to take the same page, like you said, and gain enough seats in that legislative body to basically shut down any opposition and take complete control.
And this is where we come to that feared word, dictatorship.
Dictatorship,
right? Absolutely. He becomes what we will call a dictator, which of course in Roman times, in the times of actual ancient Rome, in the Roman Republic, a dictator was appointed during a time of crisis. When the crisis was averted, the dictator would step down. Dictator just meant that you had plenary power, you had total sovereignty over everything in order to centralize power, make decisions that needed to be made, and avert a crisis. Well, dictatorship really to us becomes more like a kind of informal monarchy. Like Benito Mussolini was going to be the head of state of Italy till he died. The same for Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the same for Hitler in Germany, the same for Franco in Spain. So this is where we really start to see this rise of fascism and dictatorship. And one thing that Mussolini is big on, which we will see a great kind of German counterpart to this, is what he called spatio vitale, right? The vital space, vital space. Yep. And we'll see that this idea of the vital space needed for the growth of the Italian Empire, that he wants to gain land so that the Italian people, who he sees as a descendant of the Roman Empire, can rebuild this Mediterranean empire of the Romans.
And you touch on something there that I was going to bring up that really I think often overlooked in this. And to answer a question you'll probably get to, but the parallels are important.
Mm-hmm.
Both Mussolini and Hitler saw themselves as trying to revive that ancient Roman Empire. The question often is, what is the Third Reich? It's that third reign. Hitler looked at the Roman Empire as the First Reich. The Second Reich was that of Otto von Bismarck, and he was bringing the Third Reich. Well, Mussolini was doing something very similar. He was trying to revive that Roman Empire. And so both men sought to, they looked at the greatness of Rome in its heyday, and that's what they sought to restore. And they came about it in similar but two very different ways, I feel like.
Right. And I mean, Benito Mussolini is a dictator, but he doesn't have, at least in the 1920s and 30s, he doesn't have the same kind of vicious, violent reputation that Hitler will gain in the 1930s. Mussolini, by all accounts, is loved by the Italian people. Famously, the famous thing that people always say is, well, he might have been a dictator, but he made the trains run on time.
He made the trains run on time.
Right. And
he kept the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
For someone who brought in fascism.
Right.
Which is, for all intents and purposes, a godless state, much like the communists of the Soviet Union. Is a godless state, but he also understood the power of the people and the power of the church. And so he really helps to instate that idea of the Vatican as its own entity so that it can maintain and he can keep enough of the allegiance of the people who are devout Catholics and maintain the people's allegiance and their belief in the Catholic Church, the Pope, and God.
And so he famously institutes a lot of like agricultural reform, industrialization reforms. He wants to get Italy, because a lot of northern Italy and there are certain centers of industrial growth within Italy, but a lot of Italy remains very rural, very backwards in terms of their economics, and he wants to industrialize Italy and make it in a real industrial power on par with Great Britain, France, Germany, those states. And of course, he never gets there. Italy is completely inept. When we actually get to the war, they're almost completely inept in everything they try to do. And just like
he may have been able to gain power the way that he did,
right?
But he couldn't hold it.
Yeah,
his military leadership, as we will see, was just utter failure.
Right
after utter failure.
So Adolf Hitler comes to power more than a decade later than Mussolini, but he looks up to Mussolini in the 1920s. He's a huge admirer of Mussolini. And in the 1920s, he kind of forms this Nazi party the same year that Mussolini forms his fascist party in 1920. And they have, in 1923, after he sees what Mussolini does in Rome with his March on Rome with his black shirts, Hitler will attempt what's called the beer hall putsch. Right. So first of all, what's a putsch?
It's the overthrow.
It's like a coup, right?
A coup. And of all places to do this, let's talk. A beer hall is probably not the best place to start, but maybe some of the best ideas come out of those too.
Yeah.
Right. You've had one Stein too many, but he had been the beginning of the economic malaise that had occurred there. The Weimar Republic
total failure,
had been a total failure. And so that malaise led then to this coup, this attempt, the National Socialist, I can't remember exactly how he said
National Socialist Workers' Party
was going to basically begin the overtake,
right?
Which then simply led to the overtake of Hitler by the police to the jail cell.
I can't remember how many people are killed. It's like 7 or 8 people total are killed in the beer hall putsch, which he doesn't go straight for Berlin.
No.
He starts in Bavaria, which is considered very like provincial and rural, and it's in Munich.
Yeah.
So he wants to take over the government of Bavaria in Munich and then carry it on to Berlin later. But of course the police show up and there's a little bit of a battle between the Nazis and the police, and the Nazis end up losing. Hitler ends up in prison. And while he's in prison, he writes perhaps the most infamous.
It's one of the most
book.
consequential prison stays probably ever.
Right. He's in prison for about a year. And during that time, he writes one of the most consequential pieces of literature. It's actually horrendous. I've read parts of it. It's terrible, not just for what's in it, but also the
writing style.
The writing style is terrible. But it's got some of these ideas that will sort of become Nazi Germany. And what is that book?
So to say at this point, people
yeah.
probably are figuring out Mein Kampf.
Mein Kampf.
And this Mein Kampf, his My Struggle, it really is. There's a reason it's written so poorly. It's written poorly because it's just as he thought it, he wrote it.
Stream of consciousness.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it. And so as he pours out, these are themes that we will see. This is 1923. He takes over in 33. So the Olympics of 36 in Berlin, I know that's like a couple of numbers thrown back to back to back, but we don't see, the international community in 1936 does not see the consequences of his takeover in 33 and the beginning of these thoughts that he's written down in 23 in Mein Kampf. And those are those themes of Aryan superiority, the belief of Jews being, just the bottom of the social class. And so we start to see a little of that really flow out of this stream of consciousness in Mein Kampf. And it lays that groundwork for what's coming.
And he takes a page out of Mussolini's book, and he has the same idea of the vital space. That's literally the living space. He calls it Lebensraum. The Germans need Lebensraum, or living space. That the German state is too big for the amount. I mean, it's the state, as in the people of Germany, are too great for the space they've been given after the Treaty of Versailles. And he says, well, look at Austria, that's German. That should be Germany. Look at parts of Eastern Europe. There are German-speaking people in Czechoslovakia, which we'll get to in a second.
Czechoslovakia is another key one there.
So in 1933, in the wake of the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression, which, as you said, was a worldwide depression, the German people have had enough, right? There's this hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic. The economy of Germany collapses. The government of Germany is in free fall. It's either going to turn into anarchy or fascism, and they choose fascism basically. He becomes chancellor in 1933. Basically, the Nazi Party is in such force by 1933. They're getting about 45 to 50% of the votes, which in a government that is split up between many different parties, right? Like in America, we have two parties. They might have had like 40 different parties in Germany at the time. For one party to get 40 to 50% of the vote was unheard of.
It's an amazing thing to look at. And that's something that's hard, I think, for us to understand too. That idea of a coalition government,
a
parliamentary system there like that. It's hard to understand that, but when you talk, then it's a coalition government made up of multiple parties. When your single party is getting almost half of the votes,
you're in total control.
You have complete control, and it shows you though the direction that the country's willing to go. Now, let's also keep in mind too, though, it wasn't 100% fair in those elections. Right. Once the Nazis started getting enough control and they felt secure enough, there was some browbeating that occurred to get votes to go certain ways.
The brown shirts.
Right? So
Mussolini
and I still 10 years later, flip black shirts, brown shirts. Mussolini had the black shirts. Hitler had the brown shirts. An important distinction there. But when the brown shirts got enough control, they could flex some muscle.
And they were openly a paramilitary force.
Oh, yes.
Openly paramilitary. They wore uniforms. They paraded outside of, voting locations with guns and, things like that. I mean, it was very much almost like the voting situation in Germany becomes almost like the Jim Crow South.
Oh, yeah. That's an excellent analogy.
Where if it wasn't necessarily by skin color, but it was by your political allegiance. But if they saw a bunch of workers come in who they knew were going to vote for a left-leaning party like a communist party, they might just show up and say, hey, it would be a real shame if you walked out of the voting place and you got killed. That is not a fair election, right? So Hitler in 1934, after the Reichstag, basically the House of Parliament in the seat of government, the Capitol building in Berlin, is burned to the ground. There's historical debate whether it was communists, whether the Nazis set the fire themselves.
Almost like a Nero.
Right.
Nero in Rome.
Right. Did the Nazis set the fire and blame it on the communists? Did the communists set the fire? Recent historians have said that they do believe communists set the fire.
Okay.
Older historians, famously Schreier in his Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, he said he believed that it was the Nazis. We don't know.
Right.
But either way, Hitler takes this opportunity to take total control. He is given almost complete sovereignty over all German affairs after this by the president at the time, who was Hindenburg, famous World War I hero, Paul von Hindenburg. And this leads us to the Enabling Acts in 1935-36, which give Hitler total dictatorial power over all of German life. And then, of course, this is all on display in 1936 in the Olympics, when the world comes in and they see this Germany that's been downtrodden, defeated, and just kind of down and out for so long, and people show up in 1936 and they can't believe how
it's a totally different
how
country.
Invigorated the people are.
I think that for me, the best example of that, if you want to really look at that, because as you said, we could continue for another hour just talking about this, but famously in 1936, Louis Zamperini runs. He later becomes World War II POW. His story is told in Unbroken. If you've seen the movie, the book is fabulous, but it talks about how different the country looked and how different the people were, and how Hitler had literally rebuilt that. But Hillenbrand kind of alludes there in the last page, the last paragraph of that chapter, talking about 36. And after Louis had run, what people could not see were hidden away outside the mainstream. Outside, we started seeing the beginning of those early developed separate, not the concentration camps, but the ghettos.
Right.
For
the Jewish
for
population.
the Jewish population, and we didn't see that on the international stage.
Right.
But what was deemed irredeemable by Hitler and the Nazis was hidden from the international community.
Right.
And that is, I think it's an interesting perspective, because we don't necessarily think, but early on, those ghettos were being built as early as 36.
Right. And not only that, but Hitler in 1936, famously, the Aryan, these Nordic perfect runners are defeated by an African American, Jesse Owens.
It's an amazing,
blows by everybody in the 100-meter dash, and that's another great American moment showing Hitler that maybe the Aryan race isn't the best at everything, but he kind of glosses over that. He kind of just brushes that off. But yeah, we're starting to see, and then Hitler is Time's Man of the Year. Time magazine votes Hitler Man of the Year.
Famously, and to skip ahead to the end, famously, right? So you got this cover of Hitler and this rebuilt. I want to say it almost looks like a carousel. It's kind of odd. The Time Man of the Year with Hitler, and so you've kind of got this odd kind of cover. His death in 45 is marked with his picture on an all-white background with a bright red X. Looks like somebody spray painted. Almost looks like blood running down at his death. And it's almost like Time Magazine by 45, April of 45, is saying, we made a mistake.
Right.
We totally misjudged the Man of the Year in 36. So let us make up for it by showing this. It's almost gruesome. It's not like graphic, but almost this gruesome, like it does it kind of this X made of blood to mark out our mistake. But the revitalization of Hitler in Europe, in Germany, it's an important aspect. And the things we're not seeing that he's doing behind the scenes is he's breaking the Treaty of Versailles, rearming Germany, preparing them for what his plan is.
Right. He famously begins rearmament of Germany They were limited to an army of 100,000 by the Versailles Treaty. He blows right past that number, and by the beginning of World War II, he'll have
submarines
an army.
are being built, planes are being launched.
Submarines. Germany was not allowed to have an air force. That he starts building an air force. He moves troops back into the demilitarized zone along the Rhine River, which there was supposed to be no military presence by Germany in that area. But by the late 30s, fascism is entrenched in Europe, and we'll actually see a bit of a dress rehearsal for World War II in Spain, in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. A Republican government is overthrown in a bloody civil war by a fascist guerrilla force led by Francisco Franco and aided by Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Famously, the Russians, the Soviets are fighting for the other side, the Republican government, right? So it's really kind of this quasi, sort of a proxy war between the fascists and the communists in Spain, and the fascists win. And part of the reason why they win so convincingly is because of the German Air Force. And the German Air Force was so good at the beginning of World War II because they had practiced. They had real combat experience before in Spain. Of course, now they weren't supposed to be there. That it was like the worst kept secret ever that the communists, the Soviets, and the Nazis were fighting each other in Spain. But it was the dress rehearsal for World War II. Now we move all the way across the world really quickly here to Japan, and we're not gonna spend 20 minutes.
We spent a long time there.
So in Japan is a feudal system before 1868. Feudal in the sense that there are lords of like manors, like counties. They called them shoguns, and the Tokugawa shogunate, which had been in power for 200, 300, 400 years, falls in 1868 in what's called the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration is the restoration of the emperor, and it's also a social revolution. Basically, they're going to get rid of the samurai class. They're going to get rid of these rigid class structures, and they're going to industrialize. They're going to modernize everything. And they introduce a lot of European styles. They make people dress like Europeans. They make their military European as quickly as they can. And by 1900, Japan has completely modernized their country. And they go to war with the Soviet, well, at the time, not the Soviets, the Russian Empire in 1905, and they defeat the Russian Empire.
It's one of those moments that, without question, is the most shocking. Like it's 1905, but it's the most shocking thing of the 20th century, right? Perhaps except maybe the Boer War. That's a totally different thing. How long that took in South Africa. But Japan's defeat of Russia, when you look at the time, the Kaiser, who is a grandson of the Queen of England, with all that is happening everywhere else in Europe, and the militarization that's building up, this is on the eve of World War I, the fact that Russia, which had long been a power in Europe, is defeated by what everyone else deemed, this little island nation,
a backwards country,
a very backwards country. It should have been the first alarm bell. It should have given the Allies a little more that Japan wanted to be on the Allied side in World War I, and they kind of just brushed them to the side. But they had done this. And I think it is one of those moments that, had we really taken that seriously, we could have seen what was coming just a little bit more.
Right. And it's important to say that the Japanese formed their reputation in the Russo-Japanese War. And that reputation is attack first, declare war later. Right? Because in the Russo-Japanese War, famously, they attacked Port Arthur and destroy the Russian fleet, the Russian Pacific fleet, before declaring war. So generally, the way that war was conducted at the time was you declared war diplomatically, you severed diplomatic ties, and then you fought. The Japanese kind of overlooked that, and they attacked the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, and destroy most of the Russian Pacific Fleet before they even know that they're coming.
And to your point, that's also one more of those things where we see Japan is not going to play by the rules.
No, not at all.
And it is. And so that also, just kind of a deviation here. This is where President Roosevelt actually is asked to negotiate the end of that war.
Or Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, let's clarify.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Teddy is asked as the American president to help negotiate the end of that war. And he will be the man, and he'll get a Nobel Prize for his work in negotiating the peace between Russia and Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. So kind of just a side note there.
In the back of his mind, though, he was at one point he was Secretary of the Navy.
Yeah.
Right, and he saw.
And he loved the Navy.
He loved the Navy, and he saw that Japan and their Pacific Fleet was going to be a formidable
as equal to his Great White Fleet.
Right. That it was going to be a real problem if they decided to flex their muscles in the Pacific. And that now that the United States is an imperial power, they have the Philippines, they have Guam, these other small holdings like Wake Island. Those are strategic points that if Japan is going to expand into a Southeast Asian empire, they're going to run into American resistance.
Yes.
And he knew this even in 1905. In 1931, Japan will invade Manchuria, northern China, and they will set up a puppet state there. But then in 1937, they invade China proper, and they begin a reign of terror in China that is often forgotten.
It's one of the points I always want to drive home. We look at genocide in World War II. We talk about the Holocaust. I know we'll get to that very briefly. Let's not forget, though, the idea of a Holocaust. We have seen Holocaust already in the 20th century with what happens in
the Armenians.
Really, what Stalin does to the Ukraine is a genocide.
The Ukrainian famine in 1924.
But what the Japanese army does in Nanking, which now goes famously down in history as the Rape of Nanking, where half of the city's population, and I could be wrong, and you may have the numbers on this, but I want to say it's 300,000 are killed in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Some of the most grotesque, atrocious acts of war that we forget, to your point, we forget or overlook, carried out by the Japanese. 300,000, half the city's population. I think it's 300,000. But half the city's population in 6 weeks' time will be grotesquely murdered.
And the Japanese had a very strong sense of racial superiority, just like the Germans did. They believed that they were it was called the Yamato race, that they were the superior Asian race to the Han Chinese or to the Koreans, that they were basically what Hitler thought the Germans were to Europe, they were to Asia. And so they believed, I think, in much the same way that those Chinese people were lower life forms, just like the Nazis felt about Slavs and Jews. They felt the same way about the Chinese.
And they struck it at a perfect time. Their timing, they knew what they were doing. China had undergone at the beginning of the 20th century their own reform. As they left the dynasty era and they tried to emerge, then they tried to make themselves the struggle back and forth of, do we become more Western? Do we stay in our traditional Eastern roots? And so China had struggled back and forth with that. You had this very young leader named Mao Zedong, who was starting in China at the time, who was starting this, trying to really, not really a revolt, but in a sense, it kind of was becoming that. It really becomes a revolt after World War II and the long march that occurs there. So China was internally already weakened, and Japan they struck at the proper time.
China is effectively in a civil war by the time, maybe not a hot war, but China is so divided politically when the Japanese invade that they cannot really hold them back. Now, to put this into perspective, Japan had an army of 1.7 million men in 1939. The United States, 175,000, right? 1.7 million almost 2 million for Japan. The United States, 175,000. Was the United States prepared for this?
No, there's no way. And also look at, we're sitting on, I think it's like 10,000 horses for the cavalry from World War One.
Yeah.
When World War II erupts. Mm-hmm. And so, when you're looking at that, we are a totally unprepared army. We're totally unprepared for any kind of combat. And Japan has already amassed an army of 1.7 million.
And it's also technologically more advanced.
That was
at the time. We not only lack numbers, we lack technological advancement. Japan at the time, Germany at the time, they were way more technologically advanced than the Allies when the war began. Now, by the end of the war, that is not the case. But at the beginning of the war, it definitely is. Yeah. And also, Japan have really pioneered carrier warfare, aircraft carrier warfare. The idea that battleships are going to be kind of going by the wayside, and that aircraft are going to be used to fight naval battles, not large gun battleships. Now, they famously build the largest battleship in the history of the world, the Yamato, correct? And
I think so.
It is the largest battleship ever to be put out to sea, but it's destroyed because it is a sitting duck for United States aircraft in World War II, because the big gun battleship, the era of the big gun battleship is just over. This dreadnought era brought into existence.
It really is a very brief period of time.
From
World War I to the end of World War I.
1906 is the first dreadnought. And then after the invention of the aircraft carrier in the 1930s, the dreadnoughts really never even get their time in the sun. They're built, tons of them are built. Very few naval battles happen in World War I. They're indecisive when they do occur. But in World War II, the use of the aircraft carrier will be.
And I think, the fact that we're building an aircraft carrier, what was it? Was it 1903? I think it was 1903, 1905.
Right, yeah.
The Wright brothers test their glider, right? I think of those little wooden.
Yeah, it was like a rubber band plane.
That's all it really was. December 14th or whatever it was, December of 1903 on the coast of North Carolina, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, right? So you go from that to, by the time we hit World War I,
30 years later, basically.
And so we've advanced in 1914 when the war erupts, that we can have dogfights. And so by the time, within 30 years, we've built a ship that will haul planes and launch them
on the ocean
for these purposes. Yeah. It's an amazing, that in and of itself, I think, is something we overlook as well. And Japan does an excellent job and carries us then into,
So we're going to very quickly talk about the crisis here in Europe that leads to what we would call World War II proper. There's an argument whether World War II begins with the invasion of China. Does World War II begin with Russia invading, with the Soviet Union invading Finland? All these different things.
I think it would depend on your perspective. Right. Is it a Euro-centered focus, which we tend to have? Mm-hmm. But yes, most of Asia would argue it really began before 1939.
So the crisis in Europe, Germany is going to annex Austria in 1938 in what's called the Anschluss, right? Basically, Hitler says, I'm going to march my army into that. They mass on the border of Austria. And he says, look, the Austrian people are going to take a vote. And if they vote to be German, then we'll allow it. Right. And now this is against the Treaty of Versailles. The nation of Austria was never supposed to be reabsorbed into the German quote unquote empire. But Hitler just masses his army, marches right in. They hold the elections.
Sounds vaguely familiar,
right?
In the 21st century, right? In 2022.
Scare quotes around elections. The army's there for the election, and lo and behold, Austria, which does have quite a bit of German sentiment, actually.
It really does,
because they are German speakers. They vote to become part of the German Empire. Well, the other great powers of Europe do nothing about this. They stand by and watch it happen. They wring their hands a little bit. Neville Chamberlain in England, he wrings his hands, but that's it. Then later on in 1938, they begin what's called the Sudetenland crisis. Now, the Sudetenland crisis is a little bit different because Austria was almost completely German. The Sudetenland is a very small portion of the borderlands between Czechoslovakia and Austria,
with a minimal,
very small amount of German-speaking population. I mean, not even really noticeable. Once you get to the center of the country, there's almost they're Slovaks, they're Czechs. So Hitler says, I'm going to go in and I'm going to annex these parts of Czechoslovakia that are
German speakers.
They're German speaking. Well, this really flies in the face of the Versailles Treaty because these countries, these new countries like Czechoslovakia, were supposed to have self-determination. They weren't supposed to be bullied by larger military powers into giving up their freedom, right? So this really gets the attention of the British, it really gets the attention of the French.
But at this point, really, not the Americans are still not
right. Isolation.
It's total isolation, and so we're not even thinking of this. It's something that I kind of made a note that I want to make sure we talk about at the end, but I really want to at least drive this point home very briefly. We cannot emphasize enough, I think, as historians, the effect of World War I, and its global impact, and the fact that the effects of World War I so much lead us into World War II.
Right.
And this flies in the face of that Versailles Treaty, of Wilson's globalist view of self-determination. And that is completely ignored. But then again, Europe's response as well is so really subtle at this. There's a lot of you can do a lot of shouting, but that doesn't mean anything.
Right. And so in order to clear up this Sudetenland crisis, they meet in what's called the Munich Conference. And Benito Mussolini offers to come in and kind of be the arbitrator, totally neutral, not in any way trying to help Germany. It's not like they're best friends, both fascist dictators, both, later will be part of the Axis powers during World War II. So Mussolini comes in and they barter this deal. Neville Chamberlain comes back to England. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He comes back. He gets off a plane. He says, I've spoken to Mr. Hitler. He waves a piece of paper above his head, and he says, this will be peace in our time. With this paper, I have secured peace in our time, right? This was the liberal, and by liberal, I mean this new progressive idea of peace rather than war.
Yeah. That
disarmament, getting rid of weapons, blowing up your navy in the English Channel, and just hoping that other countries didn't become aggressive. They believed that was going to work. Neville Chamberlain believed that was going to work. Winston Churchill did not.
It's really the only voice. And I think that there's increasing studies coming out now. There's a book that's The Traitor King. It's just been published. So I've not had time to delve into it. But I think something that in our popular, culture with the crown has really highlighted is how dangerous. Is it Edward? Right? Is it Prince Edward? Right? Who defects?
Yeah, he abdicates.
Abdicates,
yes.
Not defects. Thank you.
He gives up the kingship to marry an
American
American heiress. Yes.
How pro-Nazi he really was, which to be fair, there's a lot of pro-Nazi, even Henry Ford didn't fully understand what Hitler was after.
Walt Disney, famously. Now, that's not to say
they're not
that
world leaders.
Right.
They're not global leaders.
Yeah.
But he was. Prince Edward, briefly King Edward was. He was very pro-Nazi. And Chamberlain is sitting there as prime minister, taking some directive from this king. At least taking the temperature of the pulse of this king, who for about a year has power, very controversial, but has the power. And I think really, if you want to look at one of the most significant moments of the war that we never really talk about, it's his abdication. Because here the only voice crying in the streets is Churchill saying, hey, we can't trust this. We can't trust this Hitler guy. And Chamberlain's like, oh, we have peace for our time. We have peace. Yeah. We can trust him. And you've got a king who's sitting there like,
Yeah.
Maybe I think that's not a bad idea.
I think he's a good guy. Yeah.
And I think that really, if there's a moment in history that we really could see as a linchpin in the saving of the West, that could potentially be it.
Right. And Churchill famously, when Chamberlain comes back and says, peace in our time, he waves this paper. Now, totally in hindsight, he was a fool.
Oh yeah.
But at the time, he was trying to avoid another World War I situation where, just a generation before, they had sent, the youth of many nations to be sacrificed on the altar of imperialism.
And the irony is, though, England lost more Indians.
Right.
They sent more out of India to fight for them. So really the irony, let's not undersell that.
Yeah.
But they didn't lose as many people as India did.
Right.
But France is they literally lost an entire generation of young men.
I think it was I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I think it's the number was like 40% of all males that came within the drafting, like conscription age during World War I in France were killed. Like, so they lose almost half of their adult male population.
And when you look at that, trying to then, not to wade into this too much, but when you're looking at trying to then reproduce and build back a population, France is completely set back. Mm-hmm. There's a reason they're calling for peace. They're screaming for peace. They don't want to fight. They literally can't.
Yeah.
They
don't have the population.
They have no ability.
And so Churchill famously, right after Neville Chamberlain comes back to Britain and says peace in our time, Churchill gives a speech before the House of Commons. And I have a quote that I want to read. Churchill said, quote, "This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year after year, unless we arise again and take over. We arise again and take our stand for freedom." Right? He was under no illusion that war was coming. Right? War was coming. He knew it.
And there was no way around it. And he recognized it. And I really think if you talk to the average person on the streets, they would probably recognize it. And I think that the leaders of Europe at the time just had their heads in the sand.
Right.
To what was coming.
And so in August of 1939, Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Stalin. Basically, this is the prelude to the invasion of Poland. He says, I'm going to invade Poland. You can have half of Poland, the eastern half of Poland. I'm going to take the western half of Poland for Lebensraum.
But only if we invade.
Right.
Which is a funny little clause in there, but only if we choose to invade, which if you write that clause in there, you're saying.
Say, hypothetically, we wanted to invade Poland. You wouldn't have a problem with that, right? So
hypothetically, if we did that, then you can invade from the other side.
Yeah. So on September 1st, 1939, Hitler and Germany invade Poland. And this is the kind of the formal beginning of World War II in Europe. So the next year is just this whirlwind of events.
He kind of takes this winter off, which is so old school. Right.
Yeah.
It's a very old school idea.
That you don't fight in the winter.
You don't fight in the winter.
It's not the campaigning season. We talked about this in the Revolutionary War episode.
The Civil War.
The idea of Valley Forge. Now we don't think about war as a seasonal event. But back then, in 1939, Germany had, I think it was 600,000 horses in the army that were pulling wagons, that were hauling men, that were hauling guns. Horses can't go on roads that are made of mud, right? So the winter, they don't fight.
So he takes the winter off, and then, sorry, as I jumped in there and interrupted, but that spring and the early part of the summer, really late part of the spring there, the conquest, and the last one there is the prized possession of France. What he was after. France falls in no time. Paris, famously depicted in Casablanca, one of my all-time favorite movies. Excellent propaganda. But that moment, and as that occurs, Hitler, a masterful storyteller himself, brings the same cart, the railroad car, I said car, which Germany had surrendered to France in, brings that in and makes the French surrender to him in that railroad.
He brings it to Versailles, and he makes them sign their surrender in the same rail. He was did he have a flair for the dramatic? Was he insane?
I think that's probably what I was
Probably both, right?
Oh, yeah.
He
knew what he was doing. He rubbed it in the face of France.
Right.
And we look at the history of France and England, and it's long and storied. But the story of France and Germany is just as equal all of those European powers.
Right. And what's crazy is Germany uses the same plan from World War I that failed in order to conquer France in World War II. Yeah. That the Schlieffen Plan, which failed in 1914, prevails in 1940.
And Barbara Tuchman will argue in the Guns of August,
right?
Written there in the 60s, and it's some heavy reading for a light book. It's some heavy reading, but argues that it almost succeeded.
Oh yeah, in 1914 it almost succeeded.
It almost succeeded, and really almost by this just kind of
right.
I don't know if you want to argue providential or just luck. It failed.
And in 1940, the difference really that I think most historians will point to is the mechanization of the German army. These guys aren't walking on foot anymore.
And the utter defeat of France.
Right. They're in trucks. They're moving really quickly. They kind of have pioneered this new style of combat called blitzkrieg, lightning war, that they're not going to get bogged down in this trench warfare of World War I. They're going to keep moving forward. They're gonna break through defenses, and they're just going to keep going. They're not going to worry about consolidating their winnings until they've got Paris. And they drive to Paris in 6 weeks by not worrying about what's behind them. They're like, we're going to pass the Maginot Line, this huge French fortress. We're going to pass it. And when we pass it, it's in the rearview mirror. I don't care. They can chase us. We're going straight to Paris. And it works.
And it worked. It worked. It really worked. And, it worked beautifully.
Yeah. Terribly. It worked terribly. It was a terrible, shock to the Germans and the British Expeditionary Force. I mean, to the French and the British Expeditionary Force. A lot of people, after this, France gets this kind of bad reputation that they surrender. Like, France is synonymous with surrender, this and that. France took 375,000 casualties in 6 weeks. The French army.
It's hard to wrap your mind around.
Right. I mean, that is almost as many casualties as the United States will take in 4 years. They take that in 6 weeks. Now, that's not just killed.
No, the definition of casualty is something I drive home all the time. And it's one that it's not driven home enough.
Right.
It was one of those key lessons I learned in college.
Yeah.
Of casualty does not mean you died.
Right.
A casualty can be death. It can be, wounded. It can be missing.
Right. But the key thing is that's not 375,000 killed, but that's 375,000 soldiers put out of action.
Yeah. That's an excellent. I like that.
And that is a huge number for 6 weeks, right? I mean, you're looking at during, they take similar casualty numbers in World War I in the beginning of the war. But like you said, they can't replace those people anymore. They don't have the population. And so France falls, and now there are about 300,000 Allied troops waiting on this beach in northern France to be rescued. They don't think they're going to be rescued. Churchill has to gamble that Hitler will drag his feet, basically. All Hitler had to do was give the word, and those forces would have been pushed into the English Channel. Hitler drags his feet, mainly because he wants Paris. He's like, I don't care about this army that it isn't operational anymore.
It's inconsequential to his vision.
Right. He says, I don't need to destroy this army to win. I need to get to Paris to win. And so he leaves this army on the beach in Dunkirk, and the British famously execute Operation Dynamo, which saves about 330,000 Allied soldiers back across the Channel to England. And Churchill gives his famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech.
If you want to be inspired.
Oh, so, I mean.
If you want to be inspired.
I'm going to go ahead and say it. I can't listen to it without crying.
There's a reason for that.
I can't.
There's a reason for that. I have chills as we sit here just talking about it. It's so, and you can't understand half of what he says.
No, because he's mumbling.
He's mumbling.
It is an answer to Hitler. He's looking across the Channel and he's saying, okay, yeah, our army's destroyed. We're not ready for this war. You have the greatest army, the greatest military in the history of the planet. But if you want this to be over, you're going to have to come over here and do it the hard way.
What's the famous from the Alamo? Right. Come and take it.
Come and take it, right? That flag that they fly in the Texas Revolution, that the come and take it flag, it's like if you want this to be over, you're going to have to come finish it.
Come get it. And I think if there's a moment, if we're going to talk about, you talk about the Maginot Line, which was this really arbitrary kind of thing.
Yeah.
If you want to see the line in the sand for the West, that's it.
Yeah.
Because from that moment, the fight will never end.
No.
For the Allies.
They know now it is a fight to the death.
It's a fight to the death.
Right. And that's what Churchill says. He says, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll fight on the streets, we'll fight in the hills, on the landing grounds. We'll never surrender. That's what he says. We will never surrender. And
not all of the West is really awakened to this, right? FDR is sitting there. He's looking across. I think FDR sees what's coming. I think he sees we're starting to gain intelligence that the Japanese may be starting to work already in the Pacific towards American assets. Again, it's like we knew what was coming with Pearl Harbor, but we didn't know when and where. So he authorizes Congress in with cash and carry, the Lend-Lease Act. Subsequently, cash and carry. You have to come get what you want,
right?
And what you pay, hey.
There's a famous scene from the movie The Darkest Hour. I don't know if it's actually true, but there's a scene where Churchill's on the phone with FDR and he says, those planes that we ordered, this is during cash and carry.
Right.
He says, and in cash and carry, you had to pay up front cash, and then you had to actually transport everything yourself. It was never touched after you bought it. It was never touched by an American. And this was because we had a neutrality act. We were going to be neutral in the war. And he asks him in this scene in the movie, he says, do you have those planes? And he says, yeah, we have the planes, but I can't send them. My hands are tied. And he says, we could technically, I guess we could take them to the Canadian border and you could pull them across there. And Churchill just, he's like, I can't believe this guy. He doesn't understand that there's this idea that for Churchill, I think it was true. I think he was like, he felt like he was screaming into
He really was
the void because people didn't understand how grave the situation was.
In the Darkest Hour, I think is an excellent name. But I also think then, if you really look at this, that England is an island is so apropos to Churchill.
Yeah,
because he was an island in the middle of all of this. Calling out for help, calling out for the assistance that was slow to come. And then you fast forward there, right? And I know the Battle of Britain and Operation Sea Lion, as they try to take and conquer, and they never are able to do. And this is where famously we don't see until after the war. Keep calm and carry on. Right. Is part of that. Yeah. And that story is great. That poster, which was never released, it was found by accident. It was only supposed to be released had the invasion occurred, the land invasion, and it never occurred. And that was the idea of King George VI of, keep calm and carry on. Hey, we're going to get through this. Yeah. The London Blitz is famously seen in Chronicles of Narnia, that opening sequence. But when we get to the Lend-Lease Act, we're going to change our tune just a little bit because of that moment. We see the Battle of Britain. We've got an American correspondent in Edinburgh who is telling us what's going on. Hey, you don't understand. I'm living this. I'm going to the air raid shelters. People are pulling down blackout curtains in the evening so that it's not seen. And famously, there's a milkman carrying, and you can see the firefighters in the background putting out the fire, and he's just walking across
because he's got to deliver the milk. I mean,
carrying on. He has no
so
idea.
British, just so British, and
but it's so Churchill,
right?
Churchillian.
And in the Battle of Britain, this becomes the first time that we see Hitler willing to sacrifice so much resource for his own aggrandizement. Right? He wants to break Churchill. He wants to break the British spirit, and
he's going to do it his way as best as he can.
And so he tells Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, he says, we're going to break London, right? Well, in their attempt to break the British Air Force, before they start bombing London, they lose 1,900 planes, right? Planes are hard to build.
Yeah.
They take a long time. They're expensive. 1,900 is a lot. During the Blitz, when they actually start bombing London, right? That before they were just trying to gain air superiority. Now they're trying to punish the British people because they fail in the Battle of Britain. They fail to gain air superiority, partially because the British have radar, which they don't have. So the British see them coming on radar, and so they know the Germans are like, they always know when we're coming. How do they know where which direction we're coming from? Well, it's because of radar, this new invention. But during the Blitz, in about a 6-month period, Germany loses 2,200 more planes. Right? These planes, they're just being sacrificed for no reason.
Yeah.
And
Hitler has to. I mean, he finally just has to sense
right.
the writing on the wall and give that up. He'll continue the bombing sporadically, but he'll have to give it up. And part of it is the Lend-Lease Act. At that point, we're going to start to say, hey, we will help a little more directly.
And the war material starts to flow into England from the United States because they don't have to pay for it up front. They don't have to carry it themselves. And we see planes, trucks, guns, munitions, all these things that they need start to really become available, and they're able to fight back more effectively. So now we will leave Europe there for a second, and we're going to go to Asia, really the Pacific. And, we don't want to take forever on this. No. It's a huge moment. December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy.
It's a moment that if you talk to those who lived through it, and sadly there are fewer and fewer of that generation, but they will tell you it's Pearl Harbor Day. Mm-hmm. A lot of calendars will note it is Pearl Harbor Day. Mm-hmm. Much in the same way as we look at 9/11 as Patriots Day, and most people don't realize that it's called Patriots Day. Pearl Harbor was that moment. They remember exactly where they were. It is that date which will live in infamy. The very next day, we declare war. Mm-hmm. We ask for a declaration of war, and Congress approves it almost unanimously. One single vote, senator, Jeanette Rankin
from Wyoming,
who also voted against World War I because she was such a pacifist. And her reasoning, and there's always the argument, well, like, how could you? My favorite is her reasoning is, imagine being the one who has to tell their mothers that their sons are not coming home.
And she was the first female senator.
Right. And from Wyoming, where a lot of women were voting before the
1880s, right?
In the 1880s. And it's one of those moments, as a parent of 3 now, I totally get it. It's like, I understand that reasoning. Now, again, I'm not saying that I fully support that, but we then subsequently declare war, because when we declare war on Japan, Germany declares war on us. So then we have to play this back and forth game. So we declare war. And then very quickly, what people also don't realize is because the international date line, we're attacked on December 7th, December 8th, Japan then carries out attacks on Guam, Wake Islands, and the Philippines, beginning to quickly conquer those. The Philippines don't fall right away. Famously, MacArthur will be evacuated out of there.
He says, I shall return.
I shall return. I came and I shall return. By direct orders, Dugout Doug will leave the Philippines and go to Australia. Direct orders. I mean, you can't disobey MacArthur would never directly disobey the orders of the President of the United States.
Not until the Korean War. We'll get to that later.
I would ask real quick. Yeah. You've got noted here the Doolittle raids, right?
Right.
They're really ineffective.
They're very ineffective militarily. So let's just say the Doolittle raid was an American bombing raid on Japan in April of 1942, and it is not. Everyone knows it's not going to be militarily successful. We're not going to go over there and really bomb those Japanese.
We're not going to take Tokyo out. We're not going to kill the emperor.
And I think this is what you're getting at. Why are we doing this? And I think it's 100% morale.
It's total morale. Was it worth it?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I would ask. Do you think it's worth it? And,
it gave the American people the sense that Japan is not this far off place that we can't touch and we can't get at. They can get to us, we can get to them. Now,
and within 2 months, we start to see the fruits of that.
Right.
But that's why were the Doolittle raids I guess it's a single moment, single night.
At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. It's a surprise attack, and Pearl Harbor is the docking base for the Pacific Fleet. Now, 8 battleships are there, 8 battleships are sunk. So our whole battle fleet is sunk. What's not there at the time, which really hurts the Japanese, what they don't get to attack are our aircraft carriers, which are out on maneuvers. And they were not supposed to be, but they were at the time out on maneuvers in the open ocean. And so they're not there. Aircraft carriers come to dominate the Pacific War. And if they had destroyed our entire carrier fleet that day,
I think that would be. I think the war in the Pacific would be a different
the
story.
war in the Pacific, we might have been talking about invading Japan in 1950 instead of 1945 because it would have drawn out the conflict. Now, once we launch the Doolittle raid, we start to fight with more confidence, especially our Navy. And at the Battle of Midway, we draw the Japanese fleet into what military historians might call a battle of annihilation. It becomes a death struggle between the United States Navy and the Japanese Navy, and the Japanese Navy will lose all 4 of their aircraft carriers, and this really puts a limitation on their ability to attack quickly, because now they are relying on island air bases, not these aircraft carriers, and now they have to rely on airstrips on islands rather than being able to move around and be very flexible and very agile. They're now in this without their carriers after Midway. They're now kind of stuck fighting a defensive war.
And I would argue, though, that really doesn't play a factor until later in the war. With the first, major offensive in the Pacific outside of Midway being Guadalcanal.
Right.
That was a land attack. Sure, it had an airstrip to it, but I would argue that the airstrips don't take a greater effect until Japan realizes we're pushing them further.
Right.
And they're like an animal trapped in a corner at that point. That's going to be the Battle of Iwo Jima. That's going to be the Battle of Okinawa. And part of the aggression in those, that's not till 45, the winter of 45. But those airstrips, as you said, become the islands, not the fleet itself.
So we'll leave the Pacific here for a second. In 1942, after the turning point at Midway, and really quickly, we're going to talk about Hitler's invasion of Russia. There's something that people will never learn. There are a few things that people never learn. I can think of, like, you tell kids, like, don't touch a hot stove. When you go to the beach, you put on sunscreen so you don't get sunburned, like these lessons, but you still see people out there on the beach who are just completely roasted.
Look like a deep fried lobster.
They're sunburned. You still see kids touching stoves. You still see European leaders invading Russia, right? Never invade Russia.
Don't invade Russia. Be careful. They have a winter.
Yeah, there's this season after fall called winter. And so Hitler invades Russia in Operation Barbarossa. Famously named after a Holy Roman Emperor.
Who had great success.
In the
East. And Hitler, for a man who had no faith, had faith in
this name.
Which did him no good.
Right. So early on in the summer and fall of 41, the German army is absolutely laying waste to the Soviet army. I've got the number here. It's the largest invasion force in the history of the world. Okay. 4 million men, 3,700 tanks, 20,000 artillery pieces, and 5,300 aircraft. It's the largest invasion force ever assembled on the planet. And during the opening of this operation, the Soviets will suffer 5 million casualties, not 375,000 like France, 5 million. And of those, 600,000 are killed. 600,000 in about 5 months. Just the summer and fall of an early winter of 1941-42, 5 million casualties. That is 100,000 per month killed. And that's 27,000 casualties a day for 6 months.
Hitler famously, and I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, if I had the forests, if I had the mountains, if I had the, whatever, with their wheat fields, with the oil fields, that the Third Reich would swim in plenty. And that's but he didn't learn from the lessons of World War I, and he splits his army.
Right.
And he also doesn't learn from the lessons of Napoleon. And there's also, as we mentioned, a winter.
And you mentioned he splits his army. The German general staff said, no, do not split the force. We will punch a hole in the Russian defenses. We will go straight to Moscow. One force, one army. They can't stop us. We'll do exactly what we did in every other country. And he says, no, I want this grand offensive. I want this these sweeping pincer movements to envelop and at first it works. There are sweeping pincer movements, and they envelop millions of Russian soldiers. But in the fall and the winter of 41, they crash upon Moscow, and they cannot. Their supply lines are so long now, 250, 400 miles in some cases. They can't get enough material. When they were on the border, the material superiority of Germany was so immense that they just broke right through. Yeah. Once their supply lines are so stretched, they can't get enough war material, enough munitions, enough gasoline, enough bullets even to supply this surge towards Moscow. They break upon Moscow like a wave, and they have to rethink what they're going to do. And Hitler says, well, if we can't take Moscow, we'll go to southern Russia and we'll take the oil fields of southern Russia. And this is when they initiate Code Blue. And this is, it's only in 1942, but I think personally, if you read most historians, this is the beginning of the end of the German army. This grand army, just like Napoleon's Grand Army.
The millennial Reich was falling apart less than 10 years into Hitler's reign. From looking at, again, becoming chancellor in 33, this is 42. Mm-hmm. This is 9 years. We've not even hit
100 years. 100 years. It's 9 years. And so this Code Blue, this operation to capture these oil reserves in southern Russia, stops at this town called Stalingrad.
And it's such an intriguing moment in history. Well told by the movie The Enemy at the Gates. But it's and as I recall, help me out here, right? As I recall, the Germans were going to lay siege to the city,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
And so they encircle the city.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Soviets said, well, we can just siege you.
Right.
Lay siege to you.
So, yeah, it starts out.
It almost looks like a bullseye.
Right. They're looking across the Volga River to each other. And the Volga is so important because the Volga is the heart. It is the spirit of Russia, right? That Russians feel like when the Germans get to the Volga, right, that's different. They're not in Ukraine anymore. They're not in Poland anymore. They're not in Belarus
Much
anymore.
as the Germans felt when the Allies reached the Rhine.
They're not in another country that's just kind of part of the Soviet Union. Now they're in Russia. Now this is really hitting home. And yeah, the Germans encircled the city, they can't actually break across the river, but they encircled the city on one side of the river. And the Russians, they called it the Stalingrad Academy because they said, you're learning new styles of warfare. It was truly urban warfare. They were fighting house to house. It was the city is completely demolished, completely destroyed.
Which again, the movie highlights with the sniper, the cat and mouse with the sniper, and which was again that urban warfare, which is something that just wasn't normal in warfare before that. That battles weren't fought in cities; they were fought outside of cities. They were fought on plains outside of cities, but you even think of the American Civil War. Right. You put that in perspective. That was fought in plain. Very rarely cities were set up and established as central. You may fire from the city, but you weren't fighting. Yes, there might be a little. I mean, I think about like the Battle of Fredericksburg. There are in the Civil War. They're firing from the city. There's a little skirmish in the city, but then they retreat. The city is given up, and then they fight a pitched battle somewhere else. Most famously, Gettysburg is another one of those where the name is there, the city, but the city is encircled. The fighting never occurs. After the first day, there's kind of like a sweep of fighting through the city in Gettysburg, but after that, they say, "Well, we don't want to fight in the city. That would be ridiculous." But World War II changes all of it. And so Hitler decides that this is do or die. He's going to take Stalingrad, or he's going to sacrifice the entire Sixth Army, his most experienced, most hardened army at Stalingrad. And Stalin issues Order 227, which is famously the not one step back order. He says, you can't retreat. If you retreat, we'll shoot you. And they set up these NKVD, which is the forerunner of the KGB. They send out the secret police, and they set up lines
with machine guns. And if the Soviet soldiers turn to retreat, they just kill them. So they don't have a choice. They're either going to go forward and die, or win, or they're going to turn around and be killed by their own government. So,
as a side note, looking forward, right, as you get to the Cold War, wasn't Khrushchev part of the Battle of Stalingrad?
Khrushchev is there at the Battle of Stalingrad. He becomes
it kind of elevates.
Right, the commanding officer was named Chuikov, but Khrushchev is there, and it really does elevate him, not to the level of Zhukov later, but Khrushchev really earns his kind of his legend bona fides at Stalingrad. Okay. So the German army is surrounded and destroyed effectively at Stalingrad, and at this point, they're in full retreat. And this is the turning point of the war in Europe, that the Americans haven't arrived. The British haven't really done anything in Europe. There's been a campaign in Northern Africa, but that was a sideshow. I mean, that's not to discount what happened in Northern Africa, but you're talking about battles in Northern Africa that involved 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 men.
Early on were tanks between, famously Rommel
and Montgomery.
I guess just say Monty there. And then a lot of dogfights, but not a lot of on the ground, boots on the ground that we really come to really think of as warfare. And definitely that argument for the fight, the turning point in the East, and really could almost be made for all of Europe. This is
right. Because at this point, the Soviet Union is on the ascendant. They're now on the attack, and very soon the Germans will be fighting a two-front war. But the German morale after this, they
utterly devastated.
You listen to the interviews of German soldiers, and they said, we couldn't believe that Hitler would leave us here to die. That they wouldn't believe it. That they were hoping he would say, okay, you can retreat. You can retreat. You can retreat. He never said that. And they said they were just in shock that he didn't care, that this whole army was going to be destroyed. And it was really just for him. So turning point in the East, now Stalin is begging the Allies.
And has been.
Yeah, right.
I mean, at least since we became really involved, right? Since December 41. And I never can keep them apart, right? You had the Atlantic Conference.
Right.
Then you had Tehran was first, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the first time the big three actually meet. And that's the first time he really puts forth that. But you had in the Atlantic Conference, it was just Churchill and Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And they kind of heard in the background this Russian voice saying, we need another front. Definitely by the time we got to Tehran and that meeting, he's on bended knee almost. Open another front and relieve us. And so that finally is carried out. Supposed to be June 5th.
It ends up being June 6th.
And the orchestration, the planning that Eisenhower puts together as Supreme Commander, it is a thing, really to stand in awe of.
Yeah, it was the greatest, the largest amphibious assault operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in the history of the world. On that day, on June 6th, the day of the opening of the campaign, 156,000 soldiers will land in France on these beaches, and 13,000 will land behind enemy lines, jumping from planes, the airborne troops. It was an immense undertaking, and we could talk about it forever. We kind of have to.
I know we're running low on time here, but if you want more information on that, watch Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
Watch Band of Brothers. Mm-hmm. Read Band of Brothers by Ambrose to really get an understanding on that.
So June 6th, we open this second front. It takes longer than expected, but on August 25th, the first Allied troops, led by a French general, Leclerc, they let the French retake Paris. This is geopolitics at its best. Eisenhower and Montgomery decide it's better if the French army, the French resistance army, are the first to enter Paris, and they enter as conquering heroes, and it kind of galvanizes this French belief that they withstood Nazi rule.
I got chills just now.
Yeah.
And that's not just because your room's cold.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
It is a chilling moment.
Mm-hmm.
I keep a French resistance flag in my classroom.
Yeah.
because those are some unsung heroes of this war. And you're right. It is some geopolitics, but you know what?
Yeah.
Sometimes that's what you need.
So once Paris falls, now all that's left is the push to Berlin. Bernard Montgomery convinces the Allied command to stage the largest airborne operation in the history of the world in Holland to retake some bridges and to kind of try to secure the port of Antwerp. And this fails spectacularly. It's a huge failure on every level, strategic, operational, it really is a setback. The war might, if they had focused on driving to the Rhine, the war may have been over months earlier. But famously, the Prince of Holland at the time, his name was Bernhard. He said, after Operation Market Garden, he said, "My country can never again afford the luxury of another Montgomery success." Because Montgomery famously said, "It was a success. It was a success," but it was a failure. So in December of 1944, after this failed attempt at this military operation in Holland, the Allies believe that Germany has nothing left, that they believe they don't have the ability to stage an offensive, that they don't have offensive capability anymore. They are proven wrong in Belgium in the Ardennes forest when the last great German offensive of the war takes place, and they throw everything they have at the idea of a breakthrough, breaking through the
What you really
lines.
need to see is where the line was, and
Right.
to watch to understand why this is called the Battle of the
Right.
Bulge. If you can watch in real time, and they're available out there on the internet to watch as the line retreats and the bulge is created around the Bastogne area there. And I can't help but tell briefly, I know we're low on time, but briefly the story, my favorite moment, and part of, I think, what makes the Battle of the Bulge so famous, so popular among military historians and World War II historians, is the story of McAuliffe, the American general, who's entirely surrounded by Germans on all sides.
Yeah.
The German couriers show up with demands for surrender. And McAuliffe, they wake him up. It's dead of winter, completely snow everywhere. And he believes, as his officer is telling him the Germans are here for surrender, he thinks the Germans are going to surrender to him. Now, never mind. He is completely surrounded by the Germans, but they're going, it's the most American mindset. They're surrendering to him. No, General, they want you to surrender. Surrender? Well, that's nuts.
Yeah. And
they have to respond to the Germans, and they send back to the German commander, nuts. And he says, well, the Germans have no understanding of this this American phrase, that's crazy, that's nuts. And he said they looked at each other, nuts, what's nuts? And McAuliffe looked at him and said, in plain English, it means go to hell. And it became a rallying cry, a rallying point wherein then Patton will break through, break the German line, and force the German retreat. And after that, the Germans are done. That last offensive, that push lasted only a short period of time. And by January, Patton has liberated. He's broken through.
They're into
but
Germany.
That morale was boosted by McAuliffe's famous nuts.
And so after the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans have no offensive capability. The Americans break through the Rhine defenses. Operation Varsity goes deep into the German homeland. And then, of course, the Russians are coming from the other side, and they actually get to Berlin first. And Berlin will fall on May 7th. The Germans will surrender, and that's Victory in Europe Day. And we're going to actually end this episode here. We're going to do kind of like a part 2 of this so we can keep the episode length down a little bit. So we've got more to come on the home front, on the victory over Japan in the Pacific, and you'll have to tune into the next episode to get those details.